The new patch in TFT turned the meta entirely upside down. Now, reroll feels very weak, and it's a B patch buffet for all the 4 cost lovers. And the good news is, if you love cooking, there's a lot of flexible comps that you can play. Let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list to see what exactly is on top. Let's start off with Ashe in S tier. Ashe is going to be the most flexible and versatile 4 cost to play, and that's going to be most of her power. It's the fact that you can play her in Porcelain, or you can build snipers around her, but the reality is all you really need is a baseline activation of Ashe with Porcelain and a sniper. So if you play Ashe with Lissandra and a Caitlyn or a Philios, that's pretty much all you really need, and you can start building around her throughout the adjacent traits. 6 Porcelain, even though it got nerfed, this patch is still really good, so make sure you're always playing around these augments in particular. And the other thing we want to also highlight is Ashe is very good with Exalted. Because you only really need like 2 Porcelain with Ashe and Mumu, for example, and then 1 sniper, you can really fit in a lot of Exalted to make up the rest. So if you have a good frontline package like Nautilus, you have an excuse to play Nautilus as your Exalted alongside Ashe, and then other utility and support champions accordingly. Frontline is all that really matters with Ashe because you really want to put things like Rageblade, Last Whisper, and 1 other item. In this case, when you're playing around Porcelain, Hextech Gunblade is a really high value because she's healing these units that have damage reduction, so it's really, really good. But if you're not playing her in a Porcelain setup, you can also justify things like Rooted Hurricane, Deathblade, and other 80 items. You can also have her secondary in a bunch of rerolls. Let's say you're rerolling Lux and a Mumu and a Lowy. You can also have Ashe be like that duo carry as well. If you're playing late game in a scenario like this, you can even drop other units like maybe the Alawi, and let's say you don't have a Mumu 3. You could instead play 2 Porcelain and play around Udyr, Ornn, and Azir instead, and just have like a late game cap around high 5 costs. So her versatility is her power, and so all you have to really do is make sure that you're playing a steady game plan. Ashe is not really a unit that you want to play from behind, so if you're loose streaking, you might want to consider something else. And that's because she's a composition that is pretty expensive and kind of needs a little bit of that grace period to get online. Otherwise, you might be stuck on Ashe 1 and you're bleeding out and you're not able to actually stabilize. Tempo matters a lot. As such, the early game composition that we focus on with a lot of tempo is Storyweaver, because you get an extra unit like Chaos, you have extra stats, and also the best part is you have a lot of flexible itemization. You can put all the items on Sivir, all the AP items on Teemo, all the frontline units on like Riven, Aatrox, whoever, and don't feel bad for selling it because you're not going to transition into these units at all. Lissandra is a really key unit for all these Ashe compositions, not only for the traits and the late game cap, but because of her ability to lock down specific units that can be really threatening. If you're going up against Kayn, who's really powerful this patch, as well as other really big super tanks, Lissandra tagging onto the correct target is going to be huge. One key tip is Lissandra tends to actually care about unit size. And so if a unit is like 3-star and really big, because as you start things up, they get physically bigger on screen, Lissandra will prioritize that in the 50-50. This matters a lot if you end up putting Lissandra like between 2 units that you might, it could target left or right. She's going to target the bigger unit. There's going to be other variations of Ashe that we cover to show you how flexible she can be, but we'll stop here for now. The best way to play Fast 9 AP currently is Azir, and this is going to be a board a lot of people transition to in the late game, but it's not really a composition that you're playing for the majority of the game. It ends up being something that you play for like 3 fights to close things out, but the reality is trying to Fast 9 AP is going to be very, very tricky in a lot of games unless you're really far ahead with economy or you're just transitioning from something else. You could be transitioning from Lilia, you could be having like Shojin GS and have a bunch of leftover items from Kai'Sa. There's a lot of different possibilities how you get into Fast 9 AP, but this is oftentimes a late game board you're going to transition to. One thing that we've discovered is that Hui is actually not that reliable. So if you end up dual carrying Azir and Hui, you end up getting a lot of mid results. But if you end up playing Lissandra and then having really high value units like Udyr, Rakan, and Wukong, they can all kind of use the sum of their parts to really pick apart any board. It's kind of like a team of Avengers. They all specialize in one thing that's really powerful, and if they can execute correctly, no one can stop you. Udyr can stun and neutralize backline. Rakan does a lot of AoE damage to complement these single targets. Azir's the nuker, Lissandra's the disabler, and Wukong's the scaler. So you have like all these kinds of 5 costs functioning in their own roles that can be really, really powerful. So that's why things like Thief's Gloves can be really good, because just giving them Thieves Gloves and just items onto the champions can provide enough value. But that being said, be flexible. Don't just try to roll for only these units. You could take out the Dragon Lord package, for example, and play into other utility. And this is also a really hard comp because a lot of times the big limitation is your gold. And so you're going to have to trade HP a lot, often down to 1 life. You can play Fortune into this as well, and oftentimes it can be a Fortune cash out option. But that's also really difficult because to do this all in 1 turn or 2 turns is really hard. And a lot of times Fortune gives you almost no breathing room. Build Different is really strong right now. Apologies on the website as we don't actually have the Build Different augment for whatever reason, but yeah, pretty much just imagine the Build Different augment being part of this. Build Different is a level 8 board that just requires you to have a ton of economy. And so in some ways, it feels like Fast 9 in the sense that you need so much gold and resources, and the board is very open-ended. Like you could roll 80 gold and have a different board every single game you play. But the most important thing is that you have that economy and that you're simultaneously preserving HP while trying to econ up. Early game comp, here's some high value unit that you can think about playing. Darius in general is just a really overtuned unit, and while you do generally want Duelist and Umbral, you get a lot of good compensation from Build Different, so he's just good. And then there's some high value utility like Zyra applies wounding, so you don't necessarily have to have red buff or Morello. Lux is just a good stun and it really scales well with attack speed, and then some good frontline utility. But the reality is you're going to play a mixture of all kinds of boards. General rule, always play 2 stars over 1 stars. And so even if you have like an ideal unit, say a Lux, but if you have like a 2-star unit that's an Arcanist like a Nico, just play that instead. Also, another thing worth noting is that as you're rolling on 8, you can play multiple copies of the same unit. That is something that a lot of people don't actually do. They have Nautilus pair on the bench. They hit a Nautilus pair and then they have 1 Nautilus on the board and 1 Nautilus on the bench. Just play both of them sometimes. That's totally okay. Another unit to also think about is Silas that we don't have featured here. He is also quite good. The hard part about Build Different is thinking about the ability synergy between units. Annie, for example, has anti-heal built into her with like burn effects. But if you can get burn on a unit, that actually amplifies Annie's effectiveness. But at the same time, that means that Annie makes it less important for you to prioritize anti-heal very quickly. Same thing with like Irelia. She gives you Sundering, so you don't necessarily need Blast Whisper. So if you hit her early, don't try to go for things like Even Shroud nearly as much. Instead, focus on more offensive items. That also applies to other things. If you end up going for like an AP carry, you can use units like Elune to give you Shred. And just think about a lot of the ability synergy. One thing worth noting is that you do get synergy with good combat augments that give you power or scale off of HP. So Martyr, for example, is good with Build Different because you have just more HP than usual. Heavy Hitters means you have more HP that converts to AD and AP, and that synergizes well with attack speed. Kai'Sa's max cap is still very fearsome and incredibly good in the data. If you can get her to a late game state with fully itemized Kai'Sa and Xayah 2 and even like an Udyr, you still can win a lot of games. This is probably just the AD variant of Fast 9 compared to the AP Azir. As you can see, Azir, Ornn, Udyr kind of anchors a lot of the core of both builds. But this is just like the AD variation if you just get a bunch of swords and bows and need to play around that. So it's also entirely possible that you start off trying to play like Fast 9 AP and you're playing all these AP holders. And then you have like Shojin GS, Tattoo of Toxin, and then say, hey, I'm hitting a lot of AD units. I hit Xayah and Kai'Sa. I'm not hitting the AP units instead. Maybe I can just play into level 9 Dragonlord Kai'Sa. You can totally do that. Shojin would go on Xayah in this case or Azir. So that's kind of what makes both of these comps in S tier is that you do have a variety of ways you can play level 9 and 5 costs. And you can cap out really strong with things like the Dragon Lord or other utility units. But if you're angling for this composition from the get-go, you're very likely going to play around the 4 Bruiser Trickshot variant, which we'll cover a little bit in the A tier. Small notes. Ink Shadow tattoos, generally the offensive ones goes on Kai'Sa and the defensive one goes on a frontliner. Generally, I really like having Tattoo of Protection and Toxin. Those are generally the best cases, but you can also justify a few others. If you do end up getting some of the others like Fury and Bombardment and Vitality, just consider putting it on units like Xayah, Udyr instead. One thing to note is that trick shots are very positioning dependent. TFT Guides GG on Twitter ended up posting a guide that showcased how Kai'Sa's positioning and targeting works. The guide is actually a little bit confusing if you aren't a trigonometry major or something like that, where Kai'Sa draws a perpendicular line. She can target units in the corner, but she hits adjacent units first. The most important summary is this, which is don't leave gaps in your front line and keep your Kai'Sa/trick shots in the corner. So the reason why we have position like this is just an example of Xayah and Kai'Sa trying to tag team units in the top right. If Kai'Sa is your better unit because she's 2-star, put her here, and vice versa. If you end up separating them, like Kai'Sa in one corner, Xayah in the other corner, that could be good for the mirror matchup, as we saw in the Hwangmei Into Deep video. But generally speaking, having them on the same target is good, and try to avoid gaps in the front line if you are playing against this. Heavenly Kayn basically took the role of Yone, which is Heavenly plus a strong melee champion. The build for Kayn that you're thinking about right now is Hand of Justice, Edge of Night, and Last Whisper. Basically, Edge of Night, armor reduction, and healing. If you already have armor reduction through Even Shroud or some other effect, then instead you can go for another damage item on Kayn. If you have Gargantuan Resolve, for example, you can go Hand of Justice, Titans, or BT Titans. A lot of times what ends up thriving this composition is when you have Kayn plus Morgana for the Ghostly, that does matter, and Sage. Sage is actually really key. So a lot of times, even before you hit things like Wukong and Lee Sin, you're playing like Diana on 7. Darius ends up being a really good early game for Kayn to try and ladder into it. And the other thing I want to say is that positioning really does matter. If you do end up having Kayn on a single target for a tank, he ends up killing way faster. So try to find the weak points of people's defenses. Don't let Kayn get stuck on a frontline tank. Heavenly Emblem is also really good, but you can find success without it. Versus in some other comps, if you don't have an emblem, you're going to struggle a lot. This composition, Heavenly Emblem, is really nice to have, but not that important. Another thing that people might end up having this confused with Yone is that people try to play this from loose streak, because in the past, you would like loose streak for perfect Yone items, roll hard on 7, stabilize, and kind of ladder that up all the way to a comeback. I think this is a composition you play from ahead, from tempo. If you end up playing from behind, you end up struggling because if you miss on Kayn 2, Kayn 1's going to get stuck on tanks and you take a bunch of damage. You stabilize on 1 or 2 lives, queue into a high roller, and then die. And people wonder, like, what, is Heavenly Kayn that good? Also, Kayn can have some bad matchups into things like a solid Fated board or Nautilus and Lissandra. So just be very mindful about Kayn in those matchups. 7 Fated is also an S tier and still really good. The thing about 7 Fated is that a lot of people believe that you can't play it without Fated Emblem, but the data says it's fine as long as you hit set. So if you end up playing 7 Fated from a spot where you don't have an emblem, try to make sure you're on an econ portal so you have a high chance of hitting set. Or something like Champion Conference where you're guaranteed a 5 cost on the end stages of the game. So that way you can guarantee set. You can play Syndra or Aphelios. Either are good. One thing to note is that pairing does still stay the same with Thresh and Sets. Even though they nerfed Sets Omnivamp this patch, he's still very good to get that 36% Omnivamp on a backline unit. So that way, when Kayn or other units like Trick Shots are aiming at Aphelios through bounces, then he's able to heal back up. And if you don't want to play around Aphelios, you can play around Syndra. And also, Ashe is a lot better. So if you get a Fated Emblem, can't put it on Ashe. You can also tag in Udyr. And you can also play Lissandra because Ashe Lissandra is really good. And then instead, you can just play around that core. But at the same time, don't just go into every game thinking you can force Fated. It's definitely more spot dependent, but the peak power of this is still good and can win lobbies. At the very beginning of this patch, Gnar was running rampant and winning so many lobbies. And that was because Gnar got doubled in stats in terms of how fast he stacked things. But this B patch, he's a lot more manageable to deal with. And as a result, can't really just force Gnar unless you have a really good start for it or you have things like Dryad Emblem and Mulched. In fact, the data shows that Gnar without Dryad Emblem performs way worse. So if you're trying to play this build without the Dryad Emblem, you might have a harder time. This composition is so dependent on good combat augments. Things like Baboom, Heavy Hitters, Combat Caster, Idealism, which also doubles as an item augment as well. Just really, really good. And also, it's really versatile with other special items too. You can go for a Ghostly Emblem and play for 4 Ghostly in the mid game. And even in certain spots can use things like Fated as well. A lot of times people end up kind of wavering between, do they want to itemize around Kindred first or Gnar first? I'm pretty sure Gnar's a lot better because he stabilizes your front line and he gives you damage. But if you're in a spot where you have like, you know, Gnar 1, but everything else is upgraded. You have Shen 2, Aatrox 2, Kindred 2. Just started to itemize a little bit around Kindred. It's just that Kindred starts to fall off a lot in the mid game once people get reliable 2-star tanks. Like, you know, your opponent has a 2-star Mumu. It's just kind of hard for Kindred to get past that. And they only shoot one other target, so you end up doing DPS a lot slower. But Gnar 2 doesn't really struggle with that. Plus, he can get to the back line and take a lot of damage and really get through very quickly. Titans BT Hodge, generally the best. You can go for second Titans, especially if you have Gargantuan Resolve. Dry Item is also very, very flexible. You can put it on Shen 3. Shen 3 is a really good tank, but you don't hit Shen 3 in a lot of games because of how contested he can be. So that's why we don't have items on him. But if you do get Shen 3, throw a Dryad Emblem on him, put defensive items on him. That's totally fine. And you can also double itemize through Ornn. Let's say you have Ornn with 3 items and Shen with only 2 items and Dryad Emblem. Ornn will give that item to Shen. Azir is really important to itemize as well late game. Maybe even some manipulation where you can get an Ornn item onto Azir by moving these units a little bit to the left, and then all these units on the right have full items, so Ornn's going to give an item to Azir in the corner. Bruiser Trickshot Kai'Sa is solid, but it is weaker than it was before the B patch. Prior to the B patch, basically Kai'Sa 1 and Xayah 1 were terrorizing backlines, doing way too much damage. Nowadays, it's much more reasonable, and Kai'Sa 1 can do some work, but you really need Kai'Sa 2. However, if you get everything set up, still turns out a ton of damage and very reliable to play around the mid and late game. And as we talked about before, caps really well into the Dragon Lord Xayah variant. So another thing that you can think about because you can play for really good late game cap. A lot of times you angle from an early Ink Shadow start with like Senna and Caitlyn holding items. And you do have the option of rerolling around Senna as well. But you really only do that if you're really far ahead or your tattoo is really good. Take a lot of combat augments because that's what really starts to make 4 Trick Shot really crazy because it just keeps bouncing and dealing more damage. So the more you scale up your combat power, the more damage you're going to deal. And Sylas too. Now that Sylas and Galio are buffed as well as 4 cost, they are much more reliable. And part of the reason why Kai'Sa was so good was that these 4 costs are much stronger and durable. So Sylas can definitely carry. Galio can tank even better. The other variant of Kai'Sa that we talked about last time was 7 Ink Shadow Kai'Sa, which is also really good, but needs the +1 Ink Shadow emblem or a dummy that has it, or a Sentinel if you get like a Wandering Sentinel. The hard part about this comp is usually the mid game, because if you end up playing 5 Ink Shadow and you're stuck on Senna 2 and you don't have Kai'Sa or Udyr, you can end up just like losing a lot on stage 4, which are crucial rounds. So it's a little bit of a high roll comp. But if you do end up getting all the things set up with like the Ghostly and the Ink Shadow, this board caps really high and actually wins a good amount. The one thing I will say is late game, you do want to take out things like, you know, these Ghostly units such as Shen and Alawi and replace them with Ornn and other high quality units in the late game. And for the ink tattoos, there's so many like situational things, but generally speaking, put the offensive ones on Kai'Sa and Xayah, and then we put like Kai'Sa items here on Senna to show that she is an item holder, as well as these are the Kai'Sa items that you would think about. One thing I also want to say is Irelia is also a really good holder of these tattoo emblems. So in the late game situation, you can also replace Caitlyn with a Irelia 2 and then give her like 3 tattoos and just watch her go to work. Shen Ethereal Blades is actually really, really good. And in tournaments, this has been straight up winning lobbies because it caps really high if you're able to get to 6 Behemoth, Udyr 2, and level 9 with support units. The only thing is that it's conditional and you need to hit Ethereal Blades and you need to have like a bow start. So if you get offered Ethereal Blades, but you have no bows, no rods, no prospects of getting Rage Blade early, you can struggle a lot. And while we do show that you need multiple Rage Blades and ideally Giant Slayer, there's just like a lot of bows, there are ways around that. So let's say you get a Radiant Rage Blade, then you don't actually need the second Rage Blade or even other attack speed items. You can then just go for like Giant Slayer, and then remember Shen scales off of armor, so you can give him things like Bramble or Titan's Resolve. And the other thing could be just a ton of attack speed augments. You have things like Best Friends, Tiny but Deadly, other ways for Shen to just attack fast so that way his autos can get that true damage going. That's probably a way you can justify having like 1 Rage Blade instead. Keep him in the corner, but remember that Shen ultimately is really good at killing also big time tanks. So if there's, you know, like a 3-star, a Mumu or something like that, Shen ends up countering that because that damage reduction doesn't do anything against true damage. Roll on 6, 4 Shen 2, and 6 Behemoth as soon as possible. Sometimes your board is just literally like 6 Behemoth on 6, and then just tech in some Ghostly after that. All right, now we're at Lilia. Personally, I'm not a fan. Dish Soap loves Lilia. Maybe there's something more to it than just the power of the champion. Maybe he just really liked Bambi growing up. Lilia is really hard to play because the reality is she doesn't really need a lot of Mythic and Invokers to do well, although you're oftentimes playing her in the mid game with Mythic and Invoker because it's the cheapest amount of power. A lot of Invoker units are cheap, like Kog'Maw and Janna and Laloon. And then Mythic units fall off as well, like Tahm Kench and Nico. They're not very good at the front line. And so Lilia ends up being kind of a trait-dependent mid-game carry that late game you need to transition to 5 costs, which can make her very tricky. In a lot of ways, she's like the AP variant of Ashe. Just get the baseline 3 Mythic, 2 Invoker, and you're good. But that makes her very hard. But unlike Ashe, her targeting can be really troll sometimes. Her orb just doesn't seem to be hitting the right units in the back line, and she can be kind of inconsistent. The other aspect of Lilia is that she kind of really wants blue buff as opposed to Shojin. As we talked about, Shojin is really good with things like Azir and Lissandra and even like Xayah and Kai'Sa, but not many people want blue buff, so it ends up becoming kind of awkward. So if you end up playing blue buff on Lilia and you're just not hitting Lilias, you don't have many other outs. So basically, a lot of times you just play Lilia is if you have things like a really strong blue buff opener because you're playing around Teemo or Kog'Maw or something, and you're streaking, you want to angle Lilia. But you have to make sure you're uncontested because it could be really painful if you're stuck on Lilia 1. And I've actually seen a lot of people roll for Lilia 3 and hit. So she's probably underplayed. I personally am not going to be looking to play her very often unless I'm just trying to limit test things. But she is very, very good. As for the rest of the board, this is just like a basic synergy package you could play around her, like Dragon Lords and Heavenly Utility. But you could also just justify playing like 5 Mythic, 4 Invoker in the mid game around Annie 2 instead, and then come out of it. You can also dual carry Lilia and Ashe, for example. You could have like Lilia, Ashe, and then Nautilus, Amumu, Tekken, Nico, then get Lissandra in, and then a Kog'Maw. All of a sudden, you tie in the Invoker, the Mythic, the Sniper, the Warden, everything like that. Those are another ways you can do it. Man, it's just really hard, and ultimately, you still might just lose out to like a Fast 9 board or like a Gnar reroller, so it just feels like I'm going to stay away from Lilia, but she is good, and a lot of people do actually end up liking Lilia a lot, so give it a try if you want. Center reroll has actually lost a lot of stock, and personally, I think that this composition is a B tier comp, but the stats indicate that she is actually still kind of an A. I think that's because when you play Ghostly Center from a good spot, it is dominant. It is very, very good. It's kind of like Gnar, where it's like if the situation lines up correctly, it just looks like ridiculous how strong it can be. But the reality is, a lot of times you should just be playing this core into a fast 8 Kai'Sa into like a level 9 Dragon Lord Xayah board, or be playing like this board into Ashe and just using this as a transition. And a lot of people are going to be playing this core to contest you anyways while they transition to other things, and so it's just going to be hard to hit. That being said, if you're able to get to the 6 Ghostly and you get everything online, and hey, Kayn and Morgana are better this patch, so if you're able to get that, even more Ghostly emblems and get to 8 Ghostly, you can actually run over some lobbies. I've seen center reroll still this patch, this B patch, win with like 60 HP because that's how much they were snowballing their tempo. Best tattoo is Tattoo of Protection, or you can play Bombardment and Fury. Toxin did get nerfed, so it's a little bit worse, but overall still solid comp if you can play from ahead. Find Vintage got nerfed. It's now 4 rounds instead of 3. And as a result, this becomes a really hard augment to pull off. But if you filter the stats only for Grandmasters to Challenger, it still does really well. So it's just one of those things where it does really poorly if you're inexperienced and generally a weaker player. But if you want to challenge and also some pretty big meme potential, it's still good. It's just that it's going to struggle a lot. According to the stats, I think it's like a very big losing augment in Diamond below, like a 4.8. But at GM Challenger, it's like a 4.2. So yeah, just give it a try. It's still good. And we're going to leave it in A tier because in the hands of an experienced and good player, and maybe someone that's high rolling a little bit, because you do need to get fortunate now because of the 4-round penalty, it's going to be really, really powerful. So make sure to take this with the understanding that it's high risk, high reward. It is worth noting that the buffs to Lissandra makes this top end even crazier because Lissandra is now even more reliable, and Irelia is on the weaker side. So maybe just try to index a little bit more for Lissandra and Irelia as opposed to just Irelia in the past. All right, B and C tier, let's blow past it because a lot of it is very situational. So I'm just going to make some small comments here and there and then move on. Starting off with Yorick and B tier, I think that this is probably the most underrated hero augment. I personally believe that it's an A tier, but a lot of people are just struggling with it. And I think that's because people haven't figured out what is the best variant of Yorick reroll. Right now, because Yone got nerfed, you can actually hit Yone 3 a lot because no one's buying this unit, even if they're playing Reapers. And still no one's playing Elune, even though they buffed her and they buffed Umbral. But I do believe that there's other variants you can play, like 6 Behemoths, similar to the Shen hero augment, and then go for like a Janna duo carry for that Invoker and a Loon. So give it a try. There's a lot of variations. That's part of the reason why it's experimental. We still don't know the best build of it. I still think it's very good. This Ghostly is flexible and has now more options now that Ashe is better. So we put a variation that you play around Ghostly Ashe as opposed to Ghostly Kai'Sa. Those are two of the most common lines to play, especially if you get a Ghostly +1. Let's say you're on a Spatula portal. You're like, I don't know what to really play. Porcelain's taken, Fated's taken, Dryad's taken. You can try to go for a Ghostly. And it caps reasonably high if you can get to 8 Ghostly somehow. As we mentioned here, you can also play for Syndra as a Fated option. That's going to be like a backup of a backup. But generally speaking, you can flex and just try to play as open as you can. Porcelain Arcanists are doing a lot better thanks to the fact that Nautilus is a much more reliable Warden to play around, and Ashe/Syndra are better, but you kind of need a lot of things to go right. Mainly, you need to hit Amumu and Lux 3 pretty fast. Otherwise, you're going to be far behind on tempo. The nice thing is the meta is a little bit more front to back because people are going to be playing Ashe and Kayn more often. So if they can't get past Amumu 3, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. Make sure you have a lot of mana items for Lux because she wants to cast really often and spam the back line and deal a lot of damage. AP duos, Zyra Janna and Zoe Soraka, they play the same core 7 units, but how you reroll them are interchangeable depending on your spot. Survived a lot of the level 7 culling. This patch, if you didn't know, they nerfed 3 cost odds on 7. And put some of that into 2 costs. That actually doesn't affect this build that badly. So you can actually still play this comp because the odds aren't that terrible and ends up being kind of good sometimes because you want to get to 7 and then you could still hit Zyra and Janna pretty responsibly. Because of the odds changes to 3s and 2 costs, that actually means that you can hit this composition on 7 more frequently. So I actually give the slight nod to Zyra Janna over Zoe and Soraka. I actually think that this composition is significantly worse. So I'd rather go for this duo now. But I do think that unless you get something really good like Too Healthy, Enter the Dragon for Janna, or another reason like Caretaker's Ally into rolling this, I think that generally speaking, I wouldn't advise reroll for this patch on these kinds of setups. Without Diana 3, you're going to struggle a lot. Kabuko is actually really interesting because he's the recipient of a lot of the buffs to 4 costs. Kabuko hasn't actually improved himself, but they buffed Sylas and Galio and then backline support units like Morgana. And if you can get to that 8 bruiser state with Lucky Paws, it's actually really good. In fact, this might just double up as like 8 bruisers. If you get Lucky Paws to augment, it's entirely possible for you just skip Kabuko 3 entirely, just play Kabuko to print extra gold, and then use 4, 6, 8 bruiser to get to 9 and then cruise to like a top 2, top 3. And so this composition doesn't win really often, but Sylas 2 and Galio 2, thanks to the HP buffs, are significantly better. If you get some combat augments with it, you might be cruising. Seven Story Weaver is still reasonable, but it's getting more and more crowded out by the fact that things cap higher at 4 and 5 costs, and it doesn't really have even the reroll out because you don't really go for like Zoe 3, Zyra 3 anymore. And I really got nerfed, so it's just becoming weaker and weaker in my opinion, and I personally wouldn't play around Irelia as a primary at all. And Kayle is also weaker because they nerfed some of her base damage. So in reality, this is a composition that because you're playing 5 costs like Rakan and Irelia, the data will always look good on it. If you high roll hard enough, you get +1 Story Weaver, you're able to push levels, and you get 7 Story Weaver online, you probably can top 4. It's just not nearly as good, so I could even see this falling eventually even more. And it's not surprising, but Irelia and Hui are 2 of the most nerfed 5 costs, so playing around this as your duo, you can still top 4, but I wouldn't expect to win a lot of lobbies. In fact, this is oftentimes the board you play if you are missing on Azir and Lissandra and Xayah. If you don't hit those units, you're probably buying these units and you're a lot more sad. But hey, sometimes you just got to play 2-star Hui, 2-star Irelia, 2-star, the rest of this. And it still can do well. It's not like it's impossible. The fact that this is a B tier comp with such an expensive board says a lot. You should probably temper your expectations. Moving down to C tier. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Heavenly Yone is just not that good. The odds are reduced. Yone got nerfed. Titans is weaker. That triple whammy just means that this falls from an S to a C tier comp. And then you also have the added effect of not many people are going to be rerolling 3 costs in general on this patch. So they're not even pulling other things like, Volibears and Tristanas out of the pool. So lower power level, less likely to hit. Other things are capping really high. The times you would probably play Yone are when you are rolling for Kayn and you just have Yone as an item holder because someone's got to hold Last Whisper and Edge of Night, whatever. And then you end up just hitting more and more Yones, and you realize Kayn is really contested. It's an out that you can play for. It's funny that it kind of inverted flip. Before, you rerolled Yone, and if you missed, you played Heavenly Kayn. Now it's kind of the inverse of that. Now you play Yone if you're kind of missing on Kayn. That's probably the only scenario that I would go for. Story Champion Garen, I think is really underrated, and a lot of times people play it just for the memes, but I think it's actually really good for tempo, and it's probably the only variant of Story Weaver I do want to play. But the stats kind of indicate that it's not very good. I think people overpick it. You're supposed to pick it if you have a lot of Garens early and you're very likely to hit Garen 3, and you have things like Titan's Bloodthirster already on deck. He's also really good with things like Anima Visage as an Ornn artifact because that max HP regen is really powerful with this scaling. Ever since they buffed this a couple patches ago, I haven't bought forward with it every time I picked it, but I've only played it like 3 times. I think it's underrated, but you can't really play it every single time you see it. Neeko Hero Augment is really experimental. We have like so much text written about it, but the reality is we don't actually know much about it. A lot of people believe that you can play Neeko into a fast 9, and a lot of people say that you're supposed to just reroll her in Mythic. Some people say you're supposed to play her in Heavenly, and then some people say just play Arcanist with her as a front line alongside of Mumu. The reality is you could probably do all those things, so we're putting her as experimental. Definitely give it a try. So far, the only good version I've seen is if you get the Mythic, but that's partially because you're playing really high cap stuff like Hui 2 and Vertical Mythic. Probably the weakest hero augment on average. Duelist reroll is atrocious now. I have seen people hit Volibear 3, Tristana 3 on curve and still go bot for like 5th or 6th. I would only play this if you get absolute nuts, like extended duel, combat caster, and a duelist +1, and you get like an encounter that buffs your 3 costs and just gives you a reason to play it. It's not like it can't do well, but you just very rarely win games, and I think that in general the nerf to Titans on Volibear was a really big deal, and the odds on 7 just makes it so impossible to hit. Kog'Maw is also kind of on the back burner for now. I would not really reroll Kog'Maw. 1 cost reroll is even rarer than it is before, and I just don't think very highly of this composition. Very item dependent, very tempo dependent. You need to hit very early. You almost need to hit like Kog'Maw 3, Cho'Gath 3 by 3-2. Otherwise, you're probably just going to be playing for a 5th or 6th. And in general, you'd just rather play around higher tier units. Like Lilia is just probably better on average than Kog'Maw, and you just rather play that and not have to feel like you're in the reroll lottery. Heavenly Darius is actually a newer comp, but still something that we haven't exactly refined. The times I've seen Darius do really well is when you have things like divine rolls or too much candy and you just hit super fast, and then Darius snowballs. I've seen people like get to stage 5 or 6 at like 90 HP, and then they just cap really high because they got to 9, and then maybe they even transition out. They play like Darius 3, they have a bunch of gold, and then all of a sudden they sell their board to get to a legendary board state that's in the S tier, right? Because you can just play like Titans BT on a Wukong and then JG on like a Azir, and then start to distribute your items onto the proper 5 cost. But also, Darius is just still the best opener in the game, so you can still just play around Darius, and then if you just natural a bunch of Darius, hey, Darius 3. Teemo reroll, we talked about that. You don't really play Teemo reroll unless 1, you really love Teemo for whatever reason, or 2, you hit his hero augment, aka too healthy, and you're playing around things like the Exalted, that gives you a bunch of Exalted for the 2 costs. Other than that, just play Teemo as an item holder. Still really solid item holder, just not nearly as impressive as he was before. And so it's like a lot weaker now. And just play anything else besides Teemo 3. Last but not least, we talked about all the 3-cost struggling. There's no 3-cost struggling more than Bard. The one use case of Bard, which is playing him in 4 trick shot, is not even commonly including him. He's not even playing this 4 trick shot Kai'Sa. Just avoid Bard. Double Rage Blade. I don't know. Just play like Ashe plus something else. If you play Bard 2, you're just losing gold. Avoid at all costs this patch. I just don't think very highly of this. So the only time I can ever see you playing Bard is if you start off with Bard 2 and a Rage Blade and somehow have good frontline for him on stage 2. Maybe. Even then, I'm probably playing Bard as an item holder because you notice Rage Blade, Gunblade, just need a Last Whisper. I have Ashe items. I'm probably not playing Bard. You could, but if you do, make sure you add me on the League client so that way we can queue up at the same time because I want you playing Bard in my games. So that's the breakdown of tier list. If you need more information, check out tftacademy.com where it's updated daily, sometimes even multiple times a day. In fact, by the time this video is published, there's probably some even more updates and other comms that maybe we haven't discovered yet in time for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.